If you had asked me 10 years ago who would stand beside me when I grew old, I would have answered without hesitation. My children. I would have bet my life on it. I was wrong. My name is Margaret Collins. I'm 64 years old, and until 6 months ago, I believed I'd lived a good life. Not a perfect one, just an honest one. My husband David died of pancreatic cancer 3 years earlier. We had been married for 38 years. During those final months, I watched the strongest man I'd ever known become too weak to button his own shirt. Before he passed, he held my hand and whispered something I promised never to forget. Don't let grief convince you that you're alone. At the time, I smiled through my tears. How could I ever be alone? We had 3 wonderful children. Or so I thought. After David's funeral, everything changed so slowly that I didn't recognize it at first. Emily, my oldest daughter, stopped calling every Sunday. Michael suddenly became too busy to visit. Sarah, my youngest, only texted when she needed something: money, babysitting, a place to host Thanksgiving. Every conversation became a transaction. Still, I excuse them. They're raising families. They have careers. They're stressed. A mother can invent 1,000 reasons to protect her children from blame. Until one day, there are no excuses left. It started with a family dinner. Emily insisted everyone come to my house. It's important, she said. I spent 2 days cooking. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, apple pie from my late husband's favorite recipe. For one evening, the house felt alive again. Grandchildren laughed. Plates clinked. Stories filled the dining room. For a moment, I believed my family had returned. Then dessert ended. Emily cleared her throat. Michael folded his arms. Sarah refused to meet my eyes. Something inside me tightened. Mom, Emily began gently, we've been talking. Whenever a sentence starts like that, nothing good follows. Michael slid a folder across the table. We think it's time. Time for what? For you to downsize. I looked around the room. I'm comfortable here, Sarah finally spoke. This house is too big for one person. It isn't just a house. It's where your father lived. It's where all of you grew up. Emily sighed. Exactly. She said it as though that proved her point. Michael leaned forward. This neighborhood is worth a fortune now. You could sell. Move somewhere smaller. And what? I asked quietly. He hesitated. Well, we'd all benefit. There it was. Not concern. Not love. Opportunity. I laughed. Not because anything was funny, because I couldn't believe what I was hearing. So this isn't about me. Emily frowned. Don't make it sound ugly. Ugly. My husband built this home with his own hands. I planted every tree outside. I painted every bedroom. I watched every one of you take your first steps in this hallway. And you're asking me to sell it because... Michael answered without shame. Because it makes financial sense. That sentence broke something inside me. Financial sense. Not family. Not memories. Not love. Just numbers. Weeks passed. The pressure never stopped. Phone calls. Emails. Visits. Every conversation ended the same way. You should sell. You don't need all that space. We're only thinking about your future. Eventually, I stopped answering. I thought silence would end it. Instead, it made them bolder. One rainy Tuesday morning, someone knocked on my front door. 2 movers stood outside. Behind them, Emily, Michael, Sarah. What is this? Emily forced a smile. We're here to help. Help with what? Packing. I never agreed to move. Michael pulled a stack of papers from his jacket. You signed a power of attorney after Dad died. I frowned. No. Then I remembered. Hospital paperwork, insurance documents, legal forms signed during the worst weeks of my life. My hands began to shake. What did you do? Emily wouldn't answer. Sarah looked at the ground. Michael finally said the words that shattered my world. The house has already been sold. For a second, I couldn't breathe. No, it can't be. We finalized everything yesterday. Mom, you'll understand eventually. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I simply stared at my own children, as strangers carried 40 years of my life into moving trucks. David's favorite chair, wedding photographs, Christmas ornaments made by tiny hands, everything gone by sunset. The front door no longer belonged to me. Emily handed me a suitcase. We booked you a motel for a week. A week? That should give you enough time to figure things out. Figure things out. After raising them, feeding them, paying for college, helping with weddings, babysitting grandchildren, this was my reward. I stood on the sidewalk holding one suitcase while the people I loved most drove away without looking back. Rain soaked my coat, neighbors peeked through curtains. No one said a word. For the first time in 64 years, I had no home, no husband, no family, only a suitcase. And a promise whispered years ago, don't let grief convince you that you're alone. At that moment, I thought David had been wrong, because I had never felt more alone. Rain followed me all the way to the motel. The room smelled of old carpet and cheap disinfectant. The air conditioner rattled so loudly it drowned out every thought I tried to have. I set my single suitcase on the bed and stood there, staring at it. 42 years in one home, reduced to one suitcase. I didn't cry. Not because I was strong, because the pain had settled somewhere too deep for tears. I sat on the edge of the mattress and slowly unzipped the case. Inside were only the things I'd grabbed before the movers carried everything away. 3 changes of clothes, my wedding ring, David's wristwatch, a worn leather Bible, an old family photo album, and a faded blue envelope I didn't remember packing. There was no stamp, no address. Only 2 words written in familiar handwriting. Maggie. My father was the only person who had ever called me Maggie. My hands froze. He had been gone for almost 11 years. I carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of cream-colored paper. The date in the corner caught my eye. It had been written just 3 months before he died. My dearest Maggie, if you're reading this, it means life didn't unfold the way I prayed it would. My heart began pounding. Some people mistake kindness for weakness. Never let them. I swallowed hard. If you ever lose your home or find yourself standing alone because of family, don't fight by yourself. I stopped reading. Those words felt impossible. Almost as if he had somehow seen this day coming. I continued. Go see Harold Whitmore. He'll know what to do. I made arrangements years ago that no one else knows about. Trust him. And remember, justice doesn't always arrive quickly, but it always arrives. Dad. I whispered the word into the empty room. How had I never seen this letter? Then I remembered. After his funeral, I'd packed dozens of papers into boxes. Somehow, this envelope must have slipped inside the old photo album without my noticing. It had waited more than a decade. For today. The next morning, I searched Harold Whitmore's name online. To my surprise, he was still practicing law. His office was less than 30 minutes away. The building wasn't glamorous. It was an old brick office with polished wooden floors and brass nameplates that had probably been there for decades. The receptionist smiled warmly. Can I help you? I'm looking for Harold Whitmore. Do you have an appointment? No. But I held up my father's letter. I think he'll want to see this. She looked at the envelope. Something in her expression changed. One moment. Less than 2 minutes later, an elderly man stepped into the lobby. He moved slowly with the help of a cane. His silver hair was neatly combed, but his sharp blue eyes missed nothing. He looked at me for several seconds. Then he smiled. Maggie? My throat tightened. You remember me. I held you the day your father brought you home from the hospital. His voice softened. And I've been expecting you. The word sent a chill down my spine. Expecting me? He nodded. I just hoped it wouldn't be because your father was right. He led me into his office and closed the door. Family photographs covered one wall. On another sat shelves packed with leather-bound law books. He didn't ask about the weather. He didn't offer small talk. Instead, he quietly asked, "Tell me what your children did." The words came pouring out, the pressure, the lies, the paperwork, the sale of my home, the motel, the suitcase, everything. When I finished, Harold didn't look surprised. He looked disappointed. "As your father feared." "You mean, he knew this could happen?" Harold walked to an old oak cabinet. He unlocked the bottom drawer with a small brass key. Inside was a thick sealed file. My father's name was written across the front. Thomas Bennett. Below it, another line. To be opened only if Margaret Collins requests it personally. My breath caught. That's me. I know. Harold carefully placed the file on his desk. His fingers rested on it for a moment. Then he looked directly into my eyes. "Before I open this, you need to understand something. Everything you believed your father left behind may not be the whole truth." He broke the wax seal. Inside were several documents, a handwritten journal, property records, bank statements, and one certified envelope marked "Last Will and Testament." Harold looked at me. "Maggie, what I'm about to show you is exactly why your father told me to wait." He reached for the first page, and just as he turned it toward me, there was a sharp knock at the office door. Harold frowned. His assistant stepped inside looking uneasy. "Mr. Whitmore, you have unexpected visitors." "3 of them." Harold glanced toward the hallway. "Who?" She hesitated. "They say they're Margaret's children." Harold's expression hardened. "They're demanding to see her." I felt my stomach drop. How had they found me? And more importantly, why were they here now? For a long second, nobody in the room spoke. Harold Whitmore rested one hand on the sealed documents and looked directly at me. "Margaret," he said quietly. "Do you want to see them?" I didn't hesitate, no. The receptionist blinked. "I'm sorry. I don't want to see my children." Harold gave a slight nod. "Tell them Ms. Collins isn't available." The receptionist left and gently closed the door. Silence settled over the office again. Then Harold smiled for the first time. "Your father would have been proud of that answer." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "He always said that the hardest thing for a kind person isn't forgiving. It's finally saying no." Harold turned back to the file. The first document wasn't the will. It was a handwritten letter. He adjusted his glasses. "Thomas Bennett requested that I read this aloud only if these exact circumstances occurred." My pulse quickened. He began reading. "If my daughter is hearing these words, then someone she trusted has mistaken her kindness for weakness." My eyes filled with tears. "Margaret always gives second chances. If you're reading this, those chances have been wasted." Harold paused. He looked at me. "He knew you very well." I managed a sad smile. "Better than anyone," he continued. "My grandchildren are not entitled to anything simply because they share my blood. Character is inherited by choice, not by birth." Those words hit me like a wave. For years, I blamed myself. Maybe I'd spoiled them. Maybe I'd protected them from consequences too often. Maybe love without boundaries had taught them that taking was easier than earning. Harold carefully placed the letter aside. "The next document," he said, "explains why I was instructed to keep everything confidential." He unfolded a property record. My eyes widened. The address meant nothing to me. "What's that? A ranch? In Montana?" I looked at him, confused. My father owned a ranch? He bought it 26 years ago. I've never even been to Montana. No, he wanted it that way. I stared at the paperwork. Why would he hide it from me? Harold leaned back. Because he believed that if people knew what he owned, they might start valuing his assets more than his family. A cold realization settled over me. He had been right. Another document followed. Investment accounts, certificates, trust records, one after another. The numbers became larger, then larger still. Finally, I couldn't stay silent. There has to be a mistake. There isn't. Harold turned one final page toward me. Estimated estate value, $18,400,000. I stopped breathing. No, my father wasn't wealthy. Harold smiled gently, not publicly. He spent 40 years quietly buying farmland, timber rights, and small businesses. He never cared about looking rich. He cared about building something that would outlive him. I whispered, $18 million. And growing. A knock echoed through the hallway, much louder this time. Voices followed. They're still here, the receptionist said from outside. They're refusing to leave. Then I heard Michael's voice. I know my mother is in there. Emily spoke next. This concerns our family's inheritance. Sarah added, we have every right to know what's happening. Harold didn't even glance toward the door. Instead, he calmly opened the final envelope. The will. He slid it across the desk. My father, I whispered. Harold nodded. Read the highlighted paragraph. My hands trembled as I found the marked section. To my beloved daughter Margaret Collins, I leave the entirety of my estate, including all real property, investments, businesses, and future royalties. I blinked. Entirety? I kept reading. This inheritance shall remain solely under Margaret's ownership. No child, grandchild, spouse, or future relative shall possess any automatic claim upon it. A tear rolled down my cheek. But there was one final paragraph, one that changed everything. Should any person attempt to manipulate, threaten, pressure, or financially exploit my daughter in pursuit of this inheritance, I instruct my attorney to contest every claim available under the law and defend her wishes without compromise. Harold folded his hands. He didn't just leave you his estate. He spent years protecting you from exactly this moment. Outside, Michael pounded on the office door. Open this door, Emily shouted. We know she's inside. Sarah's voice cracked. Mom, please. For the first time since losing my home, I wasn't afraid. I looked at Harold. What happens now? He smiled. Now, Margaret. They discover they never knew your father at all. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Eleanor Brooks adjusted her glasses and looked over the stack of evidence that had grown thicker with every day of testimony. Margaret Collins sat beside Harold Whitmore. She wasn't looking at the judge. She was looking at her children. Emily stared at the table, mascara streaked from tears that no longer moved anyone. Michael kept rubbing his wedding ring, avoiding every pair of eyes in the room. Sarah looked exhausted, as though she hadn't slept in weeks. For the first time in months, none of them looked confident. Judge Brooks broke the silence. Before this court issues its ruling, I want to address something that has become painfully clear. She looked directly at the three siblings. This case was never about real estate. It was never about money. It was about trust. Her words echoed through the courtroom. When children are entrusted with protecting a vulnerable parent, the law expects honesty, not manipulation. She turned another page. The evidence establishes that Ms. Collins was misled into signing legal documents she did not understand while grieving her husband's death. The court also finds that material facts were concealed from her during the transfer of her residence. Michael closed his eyes. Emily's shoulders began to shake. Sarah quietly wiped away a tear. Judge Brooks continued. Further, financial records demonstrate that proceeds from the sale of Ms. Collins' home were distributed among the defendants without her informed consent. A murmur spread through the gallery. The judge raised her hand. Order. The room fell silent again. Harold stood. Your Honor, with the court's permission. The judge nodded. Harold walked to the evidence table and placed one final item before the court. Thomas Bennett's handwritten letter. The late Mr. Bennett anticipated that his daughter might one day face financial exploitation. The judge carefully read several passages. When she finished, she looked at Margaret. Your father loved you very much. Margaret smiled through tears. Yes, he did. The judge returned to the bench. The court orders that the sale of Miss Collins' residence be set aside due to fraudulent procurement. A collective gasp filled the courtroom. Title to the property shall immediately revert to Margaret Collins. Emily covered her mouth. Michael's face turned pale. Sarah quietly cried. Judge Brooks wasn't finished. The defendants are jointly liable for restitution, legal costs, and all damages resulting from their conduct. She paused. And because the court finds a deliberate abuse of a position of trust, punitive damages are awarded. Michael whispered, "Oh God." Outside the courtroom, reporters waited. But Margaret ignored every microphone. She stepped onto the courthouse steps and took a deep breath. The afternoon sun warmed her face. For the first time since David's death, she felt light. Harold joined her. "You won." Margaret smiled gently. "No. I survived." Just then she heard footsteps behind her. Emily. Michael. Sarah. None of them spoke at first. Emily finally whispered, "Mom." Margaret turned. Emily's voice broke. "We were wrong." Michael looked at the ground. "I kept telling myself we were only protecting our inheritance. I didn't realize we were destroying our family." Sarah stepped forward. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted to tell you. I'm ashamed." Margaret looked at each of them for a long moment. Then she quietly said, "When your father died, I lost my husband. When you forced me out of my home, I lost my children." Tears streamed down all three of their faces. "But today, I found myself again. No anger. No shouting, just truth." Harold handed Margaret a small envelope. "I think your father would have wanted you to have this today." Inside was an old photograph. Margaret, age 12, sitting beside her father on the porch they had built together. On the back, in his familiar handwriting, were just 8 words. "Character is your greatest inheritance. Never trade it away." Margaret closed her eyes and smiled. She understood now. Her father's greatest gift had never been millions of dollars. It had been the wisdom to protect her from people who valued wealth more than love. 6 months later, Margaret reopened her restored home, not as a private residence, but as the Bennett Family Foundation, a place offering temporary housing and legal assistance to seniors who had been financially exploited by relatives. The first family she helped reminded her of herself. A frightened widow with nowhere to go. Margaret welcomed her with a warm meal, a safe room, and 3 simple words: "You're home now." Years later, people in town still spoke about the courtroom case. Some remembered the fortune, others remembered the legal victory. But those who truly understood the story remembered something else. Justice hadn't arrived when the judge ruled. Justice arrived the moment a broken mother refused to let betrayal define the rest of her life. And that was the inheritance no one could ever steal. 1 year passed. The old maple tree in the front yard had grown another ring. The porch David built still creaked on cool mornings. And every Saturday, Margaret Collins sat there with a cup of coffee, watching the sunrise over the neighborhood she had fought so hard to return to. The house no longer felt like a monument to loss. It felt alive again. Laughter echoed through its halls, not because the past had returned, but because the future had finally arrived. The Bennett Family Foundation had already helped more than 60 seniors who had been financially exploited by relatives. Some stayed for a few nights. Others stayed for months. Every guest left with something more valuable than a place to sleep. They left believing they still mattered. Margaret never spoke publicly about the money. Whenever reporters asked how much she had inherited from her father, she always smiled and gave the same answer: "He left me enough." Eventually, people stopped asking about the fortune. They started asking about the fortune. That made her happier than any headline ever could. Emily, Michael, and Sarah kept their distance, not because a judge ordered it, because they knew trust couldn't be demanded. It had to be earned. Months turned into a year before Emily wrote her first letter. It wasn't an excuse. It wasn't a request for money. It was 6 handwritten pages taking responsibility for every decision she'd made. Margaret read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer. Forgiveness, she had learned, was not a single moment. It was a journey measured by actions, not words. Michael quietly sold his luxury SUV and used the money to repay a portion of the restitution ahead of schedule. No cameras, no interviews. just accountability. Sarah began volunteering every weekend at a local senior center. She never mentioned the lawsuit, she simply showed up, week after week. Sometimes redemption begins with applause. Sometimes it begins with consistency. One autumn afternoon, Harold Whitmore visited the house carrying the same leather briefcase he had brought to court. "I have something for you," he said. "What is it?" He smiled. "The last instruction your father left with me." Margaret looked surprised. "I thought we'd opened everything." "So did I." He handed her a small wooden box. Inside was a silver pocket watch that had belonged to Thomas Bennett. Underneath it lay a folded note. Margaret opened it carefully. In her father's unmistakable handwriting, it read, "If this watch is in your hands, then you've already won. Not because you recovered a house or inherited my estate, but because you refused to become bitter. Wealth can rebuild a home. Only character can rebuild a family. Live in a way that makes forgiveness possible, but never let kindness become permission for abuse. I will always be proud of you. Love, Dad." Margaret held the watch against her heart. For the first time since his funeral, she didn't cry because she missed him. She smiled because she finally understood him. As the sun set behind the old maple tree, Margaret locked the front door and turned off the porch light. Inside, the house was warm. Safe. The house was warm. Safe. Filled with hope instead of fear. The place that had once witnessed betrayal had become a refuge for others. And somewhere beyond the silence, it almost felt as though David and her father were smiling. Not because justice had defeated greed, but because love, dignity, and integrity had outlasted it. If this story touched your heart, don't leave without letting us know where you're watching from. Have you ever been betrayed by someone you trusted most, or do you believe Margaret made the right choice? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your story might inspire someone who's silently going through the same pain. And if you love emotional stories where truth wins and karma always finds its way, subscribe and turn on the notification bell. You won't want to miss our next unforgettable revenge story.